Good morning, everybody. Sir Lucero here with Wine Access, Master Sommelier, and Tom Gerrie, winemaker, wine grower. I love how you call yourself wine grower, and owner of Cristom Vineyards and out of Willamette Valley, Oregon. Really, really excited for this interview. I've been looking forward to it for quite a while. I've had a huge, huge history and a good following and a reverence for these wines and this estate and what's been going on for quite a while, Tom. So, just kind of giving
Thank
a
you.
quick little overview of what we're going to do here today. We're going to talk about this particular set of wines that we have. This is the 2021 vintage here of the Whole Cluster Series Pinot Noir set, where we get to offer, under the guise of immense education, with one of the best producers out of Willamette Valley, in my opinion, and many others. The Whole Cluster Series Pinot Noir here, where we have 0% whole cluster added, we have 50%, and then we have 100%. And if you're a Pinot Noir lover, like so many people around the world, to actually see the kind of transparency and the effect and the cause and effect is one of the most exciting things that I've ever kind of learned about wine. And we have Tom Gerrie here on the show to kind of actually talk us and walk us through this and what it actually means to have whole clusters. So, Tom, thank you so much for being here. We're really excited to have you.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thank you for having me. It's
Yeah,
this.
I know it's
It's gonna be a great conversation.
Yeah, so I know you're really busy. You're right in the middle of the swing of harvest right now. I think you just told me that you have about 90% of your fruit in, so congratulations on that. Just a quick update. How does 2023 look?
I really like the 23 vintage. This is, again, the third strong vintage in a row. 21 may end up being an all-time great vintage. Quite
Sure.
frankly, 21s are one of the best vintages I've had a chance to work with, and the 22s are really strong, and 23 almost falling between the two vintages in a lot of ways. 21s have a lot of structure and a lot of acid, and the 23s are similar in that way. I really like the acid coming out of the vintage, and some modest alcohols, going into the cellar from the first pressings, going down to barrel, with some really bright, crisp red fruit. So strong vintage.
Lots of energy, lots of vibration, lots of, I guess, persistence, if you will, which is, I think, one of the hallmarks, one of the things that I always look for when I taste Cristom wines, pardon me. And with I think that's great for you to say that the acids were on the higher side of the 2021 whole cluster, because I think it's going to be a really good kind of talking point when we go through the set here of 0%, 50%, and 100% whole cluster. Do you want to maybe just talk a little bit about how this particular project came about and whose brainchild it was and how you guys pulled it off?
Absolutely. So, whole cluster winemaking is a part of the foundation. It's a part of the lifeblood of who we are as a brand and as a company, and it's been a part of our winemaking style from the get go. And I think we're regularly looking for opportunities about how to talk about whole cluster and the kinds of impacts that it has. And I think that we are looking for an opportunity to showcase, small bottlings in an educational opportunity to see what a lot of whole cluster, what 100% whole cluster can really do to the aromatics of the wine, but also the structure of the wine, really the frame of the wine, the tannin of the wine can be quite a bit more pronounced. And then showing you, zero, so destemming everything, really trying to showcase the purity of the fruit. And then in the middle, 50% is close to, most of the Cristom Pinot Noirs that we've made throughout our 30-year history. Typically a Cristom Pinot Noir is in a 40 to 50% whole cluster range. And so 50% really gives you an example of a classic Cristom style, if you will. But it's a real opportunity, I think, to see what this technique can do, and how it impacts the palate, how it impacts the aromatics of the wine. And I think there's a lot of educational opportunity to talk about the intention, I think, that goes behind the whole cluster, the why behind it all. And why it is such an important part of our history, and why we're still doing it today, and how we're continuing to try to refine it, how we're continuing to try to constantly look at whole cluster not only in different percentages, but the types of whole cluster that we're pulling off of um, specific parts of the vineyard, where the whole cluster is coming from.
Yeah, makes sense.
Um, we're looking at how to manage the whole cluster in the fermenter, meaning we do a lot of experiments with cap management, and so really looking at how we manage fermentations to look at the effects of the extraction of that tannin. So we do a lot of punch downs with cap management, but we also are experimenting a lot more with pump overs, looking for a more gentle extraction of that tannin. So there's so many opportunities, I think, here to talk about, um, the intention and the why behind.
I love
Uh,
the idea that you keep saying intention, because there's this philosophy behind this really long kind of like thought out idea of which is now what 31 years now, I believe, this year, with the idea of when Cristom was established. I think a great way to kind of to probably start this out would be to maybe just sum up what you believe your cause and effect here is of, say, 100% whole cluster versus 0% whole cluster for our folks at home. And so,
well, I think. Um, so I love 100% whole bunch.
yeah.
I'll just throw it out there. That it is my kind of wine. It is, and you sort of led the conversation, or you led earlier, with the comment of acid and how that could complement whole cluster. It truly does. So we are looking at picking at low pH and high acid whenever possible, because we lose a little bit of that in the fermenter, with whole cluster. And so we need a lot of acid in the fruit to be able to find a great deal of balance, to marry well with the whole cluster. And I think even in the 100% example, the acid marries beautifully. But it's a powerful and structured wine. And I think one of the things that you really gain with whole cluster winemaking, with whole cluster fermentations, is one of the things we talk about is sort of a fourth dimension of tannin. Obviously there's skin tannin and seed tannin, and then new wood. There's oak tannin, but this is an introduction of a fourth dimension of tannin, this stem tannin, which is which can be fairly pronounced, and it's very, very long. It's very textured. It has a great deal of weight. And so it gives a great deal of length to the Cristom wines, and in particular, the 100% whole cluster really shows, I think, that the imbalance but the intense structured tannins. I think the 0%, everything being destemmed, I think is a real opportunity to show, the purity of high tone red fruit, right? That it's there's a great deal of finesse and elegance, I think, to the wine. I think there is, I think it's an example that is very, very focused on the fruit forward nature, and it is a very, very pretty wine with a little bit greater focus on the acid profile without as much tannin, without as much filling and intense tannin,
Yeah,
sort of complementing it.
absolutely, Tom. I kind of feel like as I'm tasting through these as you're talking, which is like such a treat to have this kind of, I guess, this kind of narration of what the palate feels like. I definitely get this kind of voluminous, kind of like rounded kind of elegance and this kind of expansion in terms of the palate feel. It's a little bit more delicate with this 0% whole cluster. And as you go up the chain here, you get that tenacity and that persistence and that, like you're talking about, that long kind of like almost slightly more directional. There's still some expansion, and there'll be more expansion as I believe those tannins kind of integrate and those acids integrate. And as these wines kind of polymerize and develop a little bit of bottle patina, these wines will be able to kind of come together and its expansion will kind of grow, if you will. But right now they have this great energy, so vibrant, so alive, and this persistence. So almost there's this kind of like steeped, kind of almost like black tea kind of like profile that really kind of
Mm.
runs just beautifully right down the middle of the palate on that 100%. But there's some tenacious kind of character to this, so it's going to be really great to see, for our customers to see this kind of level of education with such a high quality wine from such a pedigree producer. We're super excited to offer these. In regards to, I think this is a great segue and great opportunity to not talk about, or to take an opportunity to talk about the fact that if you're going to do whole cluster fermentation, which is kind of the original kind of like old school, like, way that, people used to make wine for thousands of years. Destemmers, I think, came along sometime around the 70s or so, where all of a sudden people were able to make a little bit softer, more kind of plump, kind of plush, rounded wines. But in order to actually really make whole cluster wines, there has to be a certain health of the fruit. And I think that goes to the very core of what Cristom is, and your philosophy and the farming philosophy. So you talked a little bit earlier about kind of having certain sections of the vineyard kind of almost set off to the side to be that kind of whole cluster component. I'm guessing that has to do somewhat with the metabolic rate of the grapes, and the vines kind of, or the stems and everything kind of getting a little bit more lignification. And if you can maybe talk about that, and how you make that determination on what is good for whole cluster, and on a year-to-year basis, how you determine how much goes into the Cristom blends.
Yeah, I'll start just, I'll take a quick step back and I'll tell a little bit of history here too. Cristom was founded in 1992, and our first winemaker was Steve Dorner, who was winemaker from
It's
1992
legendary.
until just last year, and is still working very hard with Cristom as our winemaker emeritus. And um, you know, Steve worked from 1978 to 1991 at Calera with Josh Jensen, and really by the end of his career there, they were doing just about everything as 100% whole cluster. Uh, he had spent some time, Steve and Josh had spent some time with Jacques Sez at Dujac. And
Another
that
legend.
was so important, I think, for both people. It literally paved the way for their winemaking careers. The time with Jacques Sez at Dujac, um, and then paved the way for what we're doing at Cristom then years later, because really Steve took that philosophy from Jacques, from Dujac, to Calera, and brought it to Cristom. And so really we have been about whole cluster from the very, very beginning. And from the beginning, we've been experimenting. From the beginning, we've been experimenting with different percentages of whole cluster. And really, I think, what we find is different vineyards do better and can handle whole cluster better than others. We are finding that some soil types, soil is very, very important.
Yeah.
And the rootstock combination is critically important to then the set. And I think also the vintage is critically important. And so, in the Willamette Valley in Oregon, where we are in the Eola Amity Hills, we can have, a great deal of vintage variation. We can have some rain during harvest. We can have very, very warm, dry growing seasons. And so with this kind of variation, the vintage plays a critical role as well in how much we're going to use. And so we still experiment today. We're still constantly experimenting, with 0 to 100 and everything in between. Most Cristom fermenters end up in sort of the 40% to 60%, whole cluster range. But what we're finding as we're continuing to refine the process over time, we are finding that, for example, really shallow, skinny, rocky, volcanic soils, they want to set relatively lighter yields, lower yields, smaller clusters, often looser clusters. And so that set is an incredibly important determining factor, because if you have very, very loose clusters with relatively fewer berries, you want to back off on the whole
The whole
cluster
cluster,
percentage,
right?
because it can almost be, it's more stem than fruit in that
Right.
instance. In much, much deeper volcanic soils, Gerrie, for example, which we have all over the Cristom estate,
Okay.
a very, very deep volcanic soil. We have places that are over 100 inches of topsoil,
Wow.
in Eileen Vineyard and in Jesse Vineyard. There, the set can be much fuller, bigger
Yeah.
clusters, bigger berries, fuller set. And so really we can up the whole cluster percentage in those areas, really because there's so much fruit
For sure.
intensity, there's so
Yeah.
much fruit character that it complements it beautifully. Also, further, it's often in those deep, deep soils where we have some of the highest acid numbers, some of the lowest pHs,
Interesting.
where the the
Okay.
the, the vines are able to go through sort of that malic acid degradation at the very end of harvest, at the very end of the growing season prior to harvest, but it hangs on to a lot of the organic acids. It's relatively high TAs, relatively low pHs, and that's often coming from these deeper soils. Again,
Right.
with really rocky, shallow soils, you can have sometimes pHs that are a little bit higher. And so we are constantly looking at all of those different factors, I think. And really what we can do is we can see, because we have our own vineyard team, 16 men and women that work year round for Cristom. The vineyard team is extraordinary that works for us. They average over 9 years just working on the Cristom team on the Cristom
Fantastic.
farm. It's an incredible team. Because we have them, they can help to identify really the healthiest sections of each block within each vineyard. And so really can help, pinpoint and identify, gosh, these rows or this section of rows or these ends of rows, this is some of the prime fruit in this block.
They intimately
And
know the vineyard very well.
they in some ways they know it a lot better than I do, and so I rely on that relationship and that communication and that back and forth, and it's tremendous. And so we take all of that into account, bringing all that fruit onto the crush pad, you know,
Which
and
which
at that
sounds like,
time, oh,
oh,
sorry, sir, excuse me.
I'm just thinking that that just sounds like one of the reasons why you could be having an interview right now with me when you're about 90% in, but you're still in full swing in harvest, which is really exciting. Two of the great takeaways that I kind of took from this conversation so far is that one, it's soil nutrition. Right, you have the Gerrie soils that are really deep in some sections of your vineyard sites that actually set more fruit. The clusters tend to be a little bit tighter. There's more fruit on the vine, so you have that higher ratio of fruit and skin and juice to stems, making that kind of mitigating some of the maybe the over the top expression of stemminess that you want out of whole cluster. And then the lower percentages of the, I guess, the topsoil with the very shallow topsoils and very, very rocky situations don't really quite set as much fruit. So you have too much of this kind of, I guess, stem inclusion to juice ratio. So you back off of the whole cluster with that particular set. So you're looking at the estate as a whole, and it rings clearly through everything that you're saying, Tom, which is obviously it makes absolute sense to me when I hear all this. But I think that metabolic process there of the vine and finding that balance there, where that power and that richness can still have that suppleness and that elegance, is everything that you're coming to, which is super exciting, which is a great reason why I'm so excited to get these wines in the hands of our customers and to show, hey, look, we're able to, here at Wine Access, really, really kind of partner with what we feel is some of the best producers in the entire world, especially up in Willamette Valley. And so this all this makes just makes us all very excited here to be a part of this and to hear about this project. Um, Perhaps maybe we could talk about the fruit sourcing from this for this particular set of wines. I know that you might have slightly different sources now, considering that the whole cluster Pinot Noir probably is coming from a slightly different portion, of the vineyard versus others. But just kind of looking into kind of, I guess, a little bit more of a deeper reference point for how we have these three in front of us.
Yeah, I think first of all, your summary was spot on there. I think the soils make a
Okay.
huge impact. I do think the empirical knowledge of history, and then I would just emphasize again as a takeaway, the vintage makes a big difference. There are some vintages where a longer a vintage that can get a little bit more hang time. I think we can get away with a lot more whole cluster inclusion. So vintage, I think, is also really important. The specifically about the 2021 whole cluster series, um, this is actually really exciting. What we tried to do is we tried to, minimize as many variables as we could. And so what we took is actually 100% of this fruit is from the Cristom farm. 100% is from Louise Vineyard, in fact. So it's not printed on the bottle. It's not
It is
printed,
not. Wow.
as a Louise Vineyard single vineyard designate. But it's, I think, important to know that this is from the Cristom farm. And what we did is we tried to choose 5 clones and from an area within Louise Vineyard, and we tried to essentially, as we picked, you know alternating between uh, uh, we tried to get a representative sample into each of these 3 wines from these 5 blocks within Louise Vineyard. So we tried to minimize the number of variables so that you really are seeing, hopefully, less soil variation, less clonal variation within the wines, but it's more very focused on the whole cluster percentage. And so we alternated bins, between the 3 different fermenters, fermenting these in, basically 3-ton fermenters, uh, stainless steel open top fermenters, and then the cap management, was all of the same, and the barrel regimen and the new wood, component is all the same. So again, in an effort to try to, minimize the impact that you might be experiencing from some other things, and try to really create some focus around just the variable of whole cluster difference.
Wow.
And I think we really achieved that. I think that some of the things we're looking for with whole cluster, and hopefully you find this too. I've talked a lot about this morning about tannin, and the impact of tannin, and the impact of its structure. But there is so much happening aromatically as well that I think that we are really trying to achieve in the wines as well. There is a savoriness that we are looking for. There's a spice
Absolutely.
component that we are looking for. That's sort of, that's almost secondary, tertiary characters that you can find in some wines, after they have had some time in bottle. Things like, sort of a almost mushroom, almost forest floor. There's a lot of sort of those kinds of components aromatically that I think we are seeking as well in the wine. So much of the intention, against going back to it again, is about complexity, and it's also really, I've heard really strong arguments in both directions that whole cluster is, it can take away from, say, the purity of site expression. And while I respect that opinion, I have my own opinion that it is very much a part of the expression of the site for that vintage. Again, we just talked about how,
It's part of the
um,
cluster.
it is part of the cluster. It's part of the vine. It's part of this vintage and how these vines set in this year. And so I see it as very much an extension of, uh, an expression of place, of place and time. And because, and also I would say further, there are just, and maybe I mentioned this earlier, there are some sites, there are some vineyard sites, even some blocks within the Cristom estate that can just handle 60, 70, 80% of whole cluster, 100% effortlessly. And it still just feels so integrated and balanced.
Right. Which,
And
Tom,
not every vineyard can do that. Not every
right.
block can do that. So it's very much to me about site expression as well as complexity. So
I think that's so important to touch on for our customers and for your customers is understanding that, there's some people will have a connotation that's very, very positive with whole cluster. And because some people aren't quite approaching it with the same depth of knowledge, the same kind of thoughtful intentions that you're able to bring to this subject. And, sometimes when I pick up certain wines where, you can pick up that kind of sometimes more dried herbal stemminess that sometimes even a little bit green in its character, that sometimes there's not enough richness of fruit to support, as you were talking about. This is all still has so much energy and so much vibrancy. Now, when you're making that determination and on that quantity and that percentage, what are you actually looking for? I know we mentioned the word lignification, which is getting kind of geeky for this, but I think it's still really, really important because we're talking about soil composition year over year and the depth of the nutrition of the vine in terms of regards to topsoil and short topsoil. Will you talk about lignification, and outside of that, what part it plays in your determination of whole cluster press and how much of a percentage that'll play a part in the Cristom wines?
well, it's very important. It's another factor to take into consideration. And a lot of that has to do with hang time. So much of, often we are trying to think of how we can have hang time after bloom to harvest of around 100 to 105 days. And really, the lignification of the stems is really the ripening of the stems is really a way to think of it, is how ripe are your stems. It's the browning of the stems, but it's not always a determining factor. You'd perhaps be surprised, sir, that even sometimes stems that across the sorting line look fluorescent green and don't have the lignification that you think you're aiming for in a longer season with longer hang time, often they do not present themselves as sort of that herbaceous green character in the glass. But it is maybe in those vintages where you see something that is much greener in stem, and often it can be a bright green. That is maybe a vintage and a vineyard and a block that would be good to ease back on your whole cluster percentage. In those instances, maybe we're looking at a 30 to 40% range, where it is still really in a part of the wine. It's a part of the soul of the wine, but it's much more of a complement. Without a front row seat, as say something with 40, 50, 60% whole cluster that we often will produce. Virtually every Cristom wine you've ever tasted is really darn close to 46, 48% whole bunch. That's kind of it's a real sweet spot, as we have found. It's a real sweet spot, as we have found. But there are, lignification plays an important role. There are some growing seasons where we have a much longer season. Maybe it's 110, even 115 days post bloom. There are a number of vintages that we've been able to have that kind of hang time. And it's in those vintages where, you have very ripe stems, and you can it's very interesting to see what 50, 60, 70, 80% whole cluster can do in vintages like that. And 2021 is 2021 is perhaps an all-time vintage. It's a top six vintage for me. I think all time at Cristom,
Exciting.
and it so much came together really beautiful. A touch of rain, just making it sort of that true Willamette Valley harvest. But it gave it just enough rain to extend that hang time, to get things to hang just a little bit more. Warm, dry, relatively warm and dry, but that rain during harvest really refreshened it freshened everything up. And we got days, if not a week, more of hang time because of it.
Because of that rain.
And so I think the whole cluster is going to present itself just really, really well with the 21 vintage.
Oh, they're just showing so well right now, and you can taste and you can feel the pedigree. When I say, I think you actually do feel these things. They're tactile impressions that you feel on the palate, and I think that's what our customers really should not just pay attention to how the flavors kind of evolve and develop over the three wines, but really pay attention to that tactile impression, because that's, I think, what's really kind of coming into play. And it's so beautifully expressed here within the Louise Vineyard, even if it's not on the label, on this 0, 50 and 100% bottlings right here. And it's such a treat to go through these, Tom. I really have to say thank you so much for allowing us to showcase these to our customers, and just for allowing us to kind of give a little bit of this education, put it out into the world with the amount of knowledge that you and your family have put together and your entire team at Cristom and what's in the glass right now. It's a tremendous honor. And I'm thankful. And we all here at Wine Access are thankful as well.
Gosh, thank you so much, sir. I really appreciate this partnership. I really appreciate the opportunity to continue to talk to you. It's been too long. We should
It
talk
has
more
been a minute,
often.
huh? I agree.
But I really appreciate the opportunity to talk with you and learn from you, and learn some of your insights into our own wines. It's often experts, professionals, brilliant people like you, where we can learn a lot about ourselves. And it creates, I think, some really great internal reflection. It creates some really great internal dialogue. Questions like this interviews like this are energizing for me. I'm going to go back,
Wow.
to the team now, just buzzing about, what we're doing and what we're doing with Whole Cluster. And, really quickly, and perhaps before we end, I want to mention, you said something, earlier, farming practices, I think, play a big role here too. I think it's also really notable, some of the transition and some of the evolution here at Cristom that I've been helping to lead has been, being focused more on organic farming and incorporating biodynamic farming principles. And when we hired Daniel Estrin in 2019 as winemaker and vineyard manager, he really brought with him, from Literai, from 7 years of his time as associate winemaker at Literai, he brought with him this knowledge, this empirical knowledge of what, we wanted to do with organic and biodynamic farming principles. And he's really been charged with, how to incorporate that across the 240-acre farm at Cristom and 90 acres in vines.
Right.
And I think that a lot of what we've been doing in the 4 years with Daniel Estrin, you mentioned this earlier, a lot of the impact in the vineyard that we're seeing is with soil health. There has been so much happening, I think, with everything we've done with compost, everything we're doing with the animals and having, animals grazing the property, everything with what we're doing with, organic inputs, whether it be, cow manure, chicken manure, whatever it may be. The use of cover crops, the soil health at Cristom has maybe never been
At a higher level.
it's maybe never been at a higher level, and it's really at this, it really feels at the beginning of this transition, feels like the beginning of this evolution. But I say all that to say that things are so much healthier even now in areas with topsoil of 18 inches, 20 inches of topsoil. And that's it before you're into parent material, you're into rocks,
Wow.
you know, and the health of that is really turning a wonderful corner just in these last 4 years. And so ultimately what that means is healthier vines, and more balanced fruit, more balanced set across the vine. And so ultimately, what that means is, you know, I think greater balance with what we're doing with whole cluster, right? Because a balanced vine, a balanced set, it's going to lead to, frankly, greater balance in the glass.
Yeah,
And also, I think gaining some hang time in those really shallow, rocky soils with greater, with greater soil health. So there's a lot intertwined there. There's a lot tied together there. And I would also say that Daniel is doing a pretty masterful job taking the helm, taking the reins from Steve Dorner, and has the same kind of belief, the same kind of intention, the same focus on whole cluster, and that it remains integral to who we are. And as I see it, as one of my roles at Cristom, I'm sort of a future keeper. I'm a protector of the future, if you will, right? And it will always be, I think, a critical component of who we are. But it's been wonderful to see during this transition from Steve to Daniel, I think, how much he embraces whole cluster. And I think, again, they approach it very similarly in how can we constantly be experimenting, constantly every vintage trying to be understanding more about whole cluster and more about how we manage it, more about what's going on in the vineyard, more in the winery, so that we can continue to refine this process. And so I think Daniel has done an exceptional job, helping to lead that, and he is the winemaker for these 2021 wines. So I think really important to note that whether you've had a Cristom from the 90s or the 2000s or these 21s, you're going to see and tactilely feel the impression of whole cluster in all of our Pinot Noirs.
And that comes from the soil health. And I think that perhaps that biodiversity that's being created, that everybody at the entire state is committed to, that expression kind of is felt through that kind of reverberation, if you will, of that vitality in the wines. They're just stunning right now. So thank you so much, Tom, for talking and bringing us this kind of list here, or this set here of wines that we get to share with our guests. The pedigree of Luis is clearly singing through all of these wines, and the site and the health, and just hearing about how you're elevating wine, and not just within Willamette Valley, but the entire world in terms of philosophy, and getting this information out there, I think is going to be so. I think today you and I were able to help elevate to a small degree the kind of idea and the awareness of biodiversity and soil health, and how that translates into the glass. And so I thank you so much for that, because that's one of the large goals I think that both of you and I share with these wines, and with the wine world in general.
Gosh, yeah. Well, thank you for saying that. And I think that's, yeah, I think it's a wonderful way to wrap things up, and say that it's an honor to share them with you. It's an honor to share them with your team, and your community. And we're very, very grateful, very grateful for the opportunity to get to do what we do every day, and that we feel as stewards of a place here. I think I feel tremendously grateful for the team that I have, that they view themselves as stewards of a place and stewards of a piece of ground that they want to help protect and preserve and share, and be able to share what these sites can express year after year. And so we feel so honored to be able to share them with you.
Thank you, Tom, so much. Really, really appreciate this. This has been a tremendous honor. It's been super exciting to taste through these wines. I'm going to finish these bottles later on this evening at dinner and invite a few friends over that are going to be really excited to taste through these as well. So, um, thank you again, and let's connect soon when I'm up in McMinnville.
That'd be wonderful. I look forward to it. It'd be great to have you out at the vineyard. You're welcome anytime.